you're very, very welcome to this panel on behalf of the British Centre for Literary Translation on translation, bridges, and collaboration, working with Latin American indigenous languages. First of all, I want to say something about who I am. I'm Cecilia Rossi. I'm working at UEA at the moment as Associate Professor in Literature and Translation. I convened the MA in Literary Translation, which is the longest running MA, especially dedicated to literary translation in the UK. And I also work for the British Centre for Literary Translation as postgraduate and professional liaison. And I have a stellar panel today, and I'm very, very happy to be able to welcome Arthur Malcolm Dixon from the United States. He is the co-founder, lead translator, and managing editor of Latin American Literature Today. As a translator, he focuses on poetry and nonfiction and works also with indigenous languages. His book-length translations include the novels Immigration, The Contest by Carlos Gómez Pérez, and There Are Not So Many Stars by Isaí Moreno, both from Katakana Editores, and the verse collection Intensive Care by Arturo Gutiérrez Plaza from Alliteration Publishing. His work has been featured in numerous journals such as Asymptote, Boston Review, International Poetry Review, Kenyon Review, World Literature Today, Words Without Borders, and he also works as a community interpreter in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where he lives, and is a Tulsa Artist Fellow. So very welcome, Arthur. We're also joined remotely, this is a truly international panel, by Profesora Verónica Gómez, who is also a translator and works at the Centro Universitario de Idiomas. Verónica Gómez is from Buenos Aires, Argentina, where she is now at the moment. She teaches Guarani language and culture at the Centro Universitario de Idiomas, at the Universidad Nacional de La Plata, and also at the Universidad del Salvador, amongst other higher education institutions. As a researcher, she has translated from Jesuit Guarani into Spanish, and she also translated short stories and poetry from Spanish into modern Guarani. She has written in collaboration several academic articles on the Guarani language. She is also a translator featured in this book, Native Voices or Voces Nativas de América in Buenos Aires, which was published in 2022. I have to say that a year ago, we were with Verónica launching this at the Buenos Aires Book Fair, which was published by the Argentine Association of Translators and Interpreters and also by the publicly funded press, university press from the Facultad de Filosofía y Letras. It's called Filo UBA. UBA is University of Buenos Aires. With funding, I will explain later, from the GCRF Fund and UEA Quality Review Rapid Response Funds. And she is currently working on her dissertation for her bachelor's degree in social sciences at the Universidad Nacional de Quilmes on strategies to address linguistic diversity in schools in the southern area of Greater Buenos Aires. So welcome, Verónica. And we also have Silvina López Medín, poet and editor based in New York. She's originally from Buenos Aires. She has published 5 books of poetry, including La Noche de los Bueyes, 62 Brazadas, sorry, I'm going to say it in Spanish and in English. This is so awful. City of Buenos Aires poetry. These are poetry collections that have been awarded prizes. As well as That Salt on the Tongue to Say Mangrove, which has been translated by Jasmine V. Bailey. And her hybrid poetry book, Poem That Never Ends, was a winner of the Essay Press Book Contest and was published in 2021. She's also a translator from English into Spanish, having co-translated Eros the Bittersweet by Anne Carson and Home Movies by Robert Hass. Her writing has appeared in numerous journals, and she's also a poetry workshop leader. She's worked at the at the New York Public Library, also at the International Writing Program, University of Iowa, and she currently works at NYU. She is an editor at Ugly Duckling Press, where she's also a member of the editorial board of Señal, which is the publisher's series of chapbooks for contemporary Latin American poetry in translation. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, Silvina. So I'm quite excited about this panel because this is an ongoing project that I've been working on for a number of years. So I thought that to begin with, we were going to start just talking very briefly about how we all started working on the translation from indigenous languages, because most of us on this panel are either Spanish to English translators or English to Spanish translators, and Verónica, of course, translates from Spanish into Guarani and from Guarani into Spanish. So how did we start working on the process of translation or editing work in translation from indigenous languages? And I have to say that for me, it was a collaboration with the AATI, the Argentine Association of Translators and Interpreters. From the year 2014, there is a Comité para la Traducción de Lenguas Originarias y Minorizadas. So there is a committee working within AATI, a professional organization for translators and interpreters, working specifically on the translation from indigenous languages and minoritized languages in Argentina. And they've been toying with the idea of starting a book series. And of course, they needed funding. And it was just at the time, it was back in 2019, just at the time when there was a call at my university from the research and enterprise department asking for bids to work on projects that could use funding from the Global Challenges Research Fund, which is the money that the government, the UK government, had promised as part of the ODA, the Overseas Development Aid funding. And basically, I applied through UEA. It was internal funding, quality review, rapid response funds, and we got the money. And that's how we have the books. So last year, finally, we managed to publish 3 books. This in particular, Voces Nativas, Native Voices of America, the Americas in Buenos Aires, challenges the understanding or the perception that in Buenos Aires only Spanish is spoken. There are also indigenous languages being spoken today and people composing stories and poems in those languages. And this is a substantial collection originally written in Quechua, which is a kind of Creole developed from Quechua, which is spoken in Santiago del Estero, and an amazing book. And this one, a book, La Voz del Viento, the wind, the voice of the wind, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to pronounce this, is basically a comprehensive study and collection of works from the Guñun Acuña people, or people from the Pampas, the middle of the province of Buenos Aires, traditionally known as Tehuelches Septentrionales, but it was a language that had been declared extinct by the UNESCO, and it was rediscovered. So I'm going to start with Arthur here. How did you start working on translation from indigenous languages?
Sure. Well, first, thank you very much, Cecilia, for the invitation, and it's a great pleasure to share this panel with Verónica and with Silvina. Hello, everybody. I got started translating literature from indigenous languages in my capacity working with Latin American Literature Today, which is a journal that I helped to found in 2017 at the University of Oklahoma. I'm from the US state of Oklahoma, even though I don't really sound like it. My family's from the UK. And some of you might be aware that Oklahoma has a very important history and also current day presence of indigenous peoples and languages. For many years, it was what we might call the general indigenous reservation of the United States, and a great many people from what's now the east coast of the United States were displaced to Oklahoma. So when we founded the journal in 2017, we felt it was crucially important, partly as a journal that attempts to encompass Latin America, that we should represent those languages and authors, because after all, they are a crucial part of the Latin American literary landscape, along with Spanish and Portuguese and other languages, and also because of the geographical circumstances of the journal. I think any cultural project that comes from where we come from needs to have that priority. From our earliest issues, we've made a point to publish writing in Indigenous languages, and that's given me the opportunity to work with many writers who do work in different Indigenous languages. I translate from Spanish myself, so in my case, this work has been what we might call bridge translations, working with Spanish versions of the text that have been translated in many cases by the authors themselves, and in some cases by other translators who work with those specific Indigenous languages.
Thank you, Arthur. And Silvina, can I ask you next how you got involved with editing books which are trilingual editions, as in the case of Miguel Ángel Mesa's work?
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here with Arthur, Cecilia, and Verónica. As Cecilia mentioned, I am a member of the editorial board of Señal, which is the Latin American series that's published by Águila Queen Press, which is an independent Brooklyn-based press. And Señal has published usually 2 or 3 chapbooks per year, and we have so far published around 20 authors from different sites in Latin America, 9 sites to be more precise, and we have been thinking always about trying to expand and push against frames that often shape what's Latin American literature, particularly in the US context, and we try to publish a diversity of voices in a diversity of languages. And thus far we have published 2 chapbooks, which I have here. One is the one that Cecilia mentioned. One is trilingual Guarani, Spanish, English, and it's by Miguel Ángel Mesa, translated by Elisa Taber. And the other one is Tzotzil, Spanish, English, by Enriqueta Lunes, translated by Claire Sullivan. And we are very interested in expanding this space for Indigenous languages, and we emphasize that in our annual open call, to which we call here to all translators.
Thank you, Silvina. And Verónica, so with Verónica, I'm going to put the question in Spanish to her, and then we'll translate myself. Verónica will respond in Spanish, and I will translate into English. Just so you know, this panel is being recorded, so we are going to have access to a transcript, which we are going to translate into Spanish. And the idea with Arthur is that we're going to perhaps do something together to write an article on the panel, quoting extensively from this discussion to publish probably in Latin American Literature Today. So, Verónica, tengo una pregunta para vos. Estábamos hablando de cómo nos iniciamos en el proyecto de traducir de lenguas originarias al español o al inglés. Entonces, mi pregunta para vos es, como vos tenés un título universitario de profesora de idioma guaraní, ¿cómo es que empezaste a traducir? So my question to Verónica is about her starting career as a translator. Her first degree is a degree in teaching Guarani language and culture. So my question to her is to do with how she started off translating from Guarani or into Guarani.
Buenísimo. ¿Se me escucha?
¿Sí?
Bien. Bueno, muchas gracias por la invitación. La verdad que es un placer estar acá compartiendo con ustedes y hablar un poco sobre mi trabajo. Bueno, como dijiste vos, yo soy profesora de lengua y cultura guaraní. ¿Y de qué manera me inicié en esto de la traducción? En el lugar en donde yo trabajo, que es el Centro Universitario de Idiomas, hace algunos años empezaron a ofrecer el servicio de traducción. Yo ya hacía varios años que trabajaba en ese lugar y la coordinadora del Departamento de Lenguas Originarias del Centro Universitario armó un equipo de profesores y traductores de lenguas originarias. Muchos de ellos ya varios años tenían de experiencia en traducción. Entonces armamos un equipo en el que nos ayudamos entre todos, sobre todo las personas que más tenían experiencia, nos ayudaron a los demás a adquirir algunas habilidades de traducción, ¿no? Y las traducciones que empezamos a hacer fueron más que nada traducciones oficiales, ¿no? O traducciones que eran como recomendaciones para prevenir enfermedades, ese tipo de traducciones hacíamos desde esa institución. Pero algo muy importante para nosotros, para los profesores de lenguas originarias, fue la ayuda que recibimos de la ATI, justamente, ¿no? Ellos nos ofrecieron a nosotros herramientas para poder seguir haciendo traducciones, nos ofrecieron cursos gratuitos, ¿sí? Entonces, porque acá en Buenos Aires no existe un traductorado oficial de lenguas originarias. Entonces, esa ayuda fue para nosotros muy grande. Entonces, a partir de esa ayuda que nos dieron de la ATI, nosotros empezamos, en mi caso personal, a traducir cuentos, ¿sí? Empezaron a llegar propuestas para traducir cuentos, poesías, ¿sí? Y en este momento yo ya llevo bastantes años de experiencia traduciendo libros, álbumes para niños también. También he hecho traducción audiovisual y subtitulado, y esas herramientas fueron dadas por la ATI, entonces eso me parece importante remarcarlo, ¿no?
Okay, thank you very much. Gracias, Verónica. Well, she started off by thanking everyone for inviting her, and she's very excited to be here to talk about her work. She started her work as a language teacher at the Centro Universitario de Idiomas, or the University Center for Language Teaching, and they started at this center to offer translation services. So they created a team of translators and teachers of indigenous languages who would work together and help each other out. It was a first network, I would say. And the emerging translators were actually helped and trained and offered advice by the the translators with more experience. And at first, most of the work was sort of public or official sort of translations, for example, to do with public health, warning about certain diseases, etc. And it was thanks to the help of ADI, the professional organization of translators and interpreters in Argentina, that they started off being offered the tools to understand what it took to translate literature or to translate books. So they were offered free training. ADI, the Argentine Association, offered them free training in translation, because there is no official, no courses, no training whatsoever for translators who want to specialize in translation from indigenous or minoritized languages. So it was in this way that she started translating stories, poems, also children's books, and she also does some subtitling and interpreting work. Thank you. Gracias, Verónica. So we're going to move on to the next question, and I want to address the title of this panel, which is Translation, Bridges and Collaboration. And the title is very much an attempt to highlight the long-term collaboration implied in the work of translation from indigenous languages, a collaboration that implies commitment as well. One of the things that we talk a lot about in UEA is academic social responsibility, or ASR. So we are in a position of privilege because we're in academia. I work in translation, I have my translation work, but I also have access and resource to funding. So it was my idea that I have to be sort of exercising those privileges responsibly and applying for funding whenever I could. And that's how I started working on this. So this is a long-term project, a long-term collaboration. And I would ask each of you to describe your work as editors, as translators, as teachers committed to the dissemination of a culture and a language. Yeah, let's talk about this. So Arthur, your day-to-day work with indigenous languages, what does it entail?
Sure, and can I just say, first of all, a round of applause to Cecilia for that consecutive interpreting, right? Incredible.
I'm not trained.
No, incredible. But yeah, so I think that, as I said, my translation work that has to do with indigenous languages is always using a pre-existing Spanish version. But I think it can be kind of easy to essentialize a little bit what that means. It's always very different, even though that step is always there. And perhaps I can just illustrate that with a couple of examples from LALT, Latin American Literatures a Day. One example, some work that I really enjoyed, was working with a Mapuche poet from Chile named Elicura Chihuaylaf, who is seen as kind of the godfather of Mapuche letters. In 2020, he won Chile's National Prize for Literature and was the first indigenous writer to do so. He is a writer who writes in Mapudungun, the Mapuche language, and also in Spanish. He translates much of his own writing from Mapudungun to Spanish, and he's also a translator from Spanish to Mapudungun. He's translated Pablo Neruda, among others. And in translating his work for LALT, I was very conscious of the fact that as a translator from his own language into Spanish, his work in Spanish is very much in conversation with the Spanish language canon, let's say, and in dialogue with literature that is written in Spanish. So translating his work into English, my goal, and these were poems specifically, was to create new versions of these poems in English that were similarly in conversation with the kind of traditions of English language poetry, right, mirroring that kind of interest of his. And to give a very contrasting example, another writer we published in LALT is named Edwin Lucero Rinza. He's a young poet. He was a teenager, in fact, when we published him. And he speaks a variant of Quechua that's called Cañaris Quechua from Peru. And he published a poetry collection in his language that was, in fact, the first ever print poetry book that was published in that language. And the book was published specifically and exclusively in Cañaris Quechua, without a Spanish version, although many poets will translate their own work into Spanish for editorial reasons. So when we shared his work in LALT, he agreed to translate a few poems into Spanish simply for the ease of our readers, right? But Edwin is very specifically not a translator into Spanish. He doesn't want to be a Spanish language poet. That's not his intention. And so the translations that he created were much more like glosses, we could say, of the text, attempts to kind of get some level of the meaning across, but without any literary pretense whatsoever, and not attempting to be good poems, let's say, in Spanish. So translating those poems, I did the same thing, giving rise to poems that in English might seem not very good, you know, or that might seem very much not to be kind of in dialogue with the traditions of English language poetry. But that's because in that case, the bridge was not really meant to give you access to the other side, right? It was supposed to be more of a kind of a rickety bridge, or one that lets you glimpse the other side but not quite get there. So anyway, I could go on, but those are kind of examples of how different it can be.
I found this fascinating because, of course, we had a number of conversations before this panel, and the idea that the bridge translation, it's a translation, is never a transparent rendition of the source poem or the source text. And it's been done by someone who comes from somewhere, has a background, a professional background, and not only the background of their identity, cultural identity, linguistic identity, etc., etc. And what we're discussing here, they're very different types of translations. And I'm fascinated that Arthur has to respond to those different types of translations into Spanish, and then go back to the writer and ask, I'm doing this, are you okay with this? And there's a whole process and a collaboration and a conversation around the process. So that's great. Thank you so much. Silvina, as an editor, especially I was I mean, it's a beautiful collection. If you have not come across it, do go into the Ugly Duckling Press website and look for Miguel Ángel Mesa. It's a beautiful collection of poems, and I love the way it's been published with the Guarani, the English, and then you've got the Spanish and the Guarani again. And that's telling a story of how the languages have interacted with each other, influenced each other. So what was it like to be the editor and to work with Eliza Tabor, the translator? There are lots of
Yes.
translators, by the way, not just Eliza. Yeah.
Yeah, so it was very interesting to listen to Arthur and to emphasize the different experiences, the diverse experiences with Spanish working as a bridge, as Arthur gave some examples. In our case, for instance, in the case of Enriqueta Lunes, which is the other plaquette, Enriqueta writes both in Tzotzil and in Spanish. So that's another different experience. She works in both languages, and Claire Sullivan translated directly from the Spanish. But in the case of Miguel Ángel Mesa, as you mentioned, Cecilia, was a very special case, and that's why we edited that way. That we have on one side Guarani in Spanish, on the other side Guarani English, and the translator Eliza Taber worked very closely with the author, and she had access to both languages. So Elisa herself says this translation, my translation, wouldn't exist without this bridge of the Spanish, but she also had access to the Guarani. She's very knowledgeable about the Guarani as a culture, not only as a translator. And so she was able to bring into the English the relation to Guarani myth and other marks of the Guarani culture within the plaquette. So these are very diverse experiences that change from book to book and author to author, of course.
Yeah, and I think again that individual attention to the work of the writer in the first instance, and whether the writer themselves are bilingual writers or they are also translators, and also I think that with the Miguel Ángel Mesa book, the interesting thing was that the original Guarani was published in 1985. I think there was a good 30 years between the publication of that book in the original Guarani and the publication of the translation, and how Miguel Ángel then went back to the poems and changed the Guarani poems in the process of having them translated into Spanish and English.
Yeah, and also this reminds me that actually in this case, Miguel Ángel Mesa speaks both Guarani and Spanish, which is totally common in Paraguay, especially after Grosner. And but those Spanish versions weren't self-translated by Miguel Ángel Mesa, so that he wrote the Guarani, then someone else translated into Spanish in 85, and then Elisa Taber translated from both into English, and as you said, Cecilia, Miguel Ángel Mesa returned to the original Guarani and also reworked that. So it was a very complex process and very interesting.
Yeah. Thank you, that's amazing. And Verónica, ahora te toca a vos. Te voy a hacer una pregunta con respecto a tu experiencia, que es muy diferente a la experiencia de Silvina y Arthur. I'm going to ask Verónica about her own experience, because it's very different from the experience of Silvina as an editor and the experience of Arthur as both translator and editor. So, contanos de tu lenguaje. Tell us about your language and about the experience of translating stories for Voces Nativas, for this book, okay? Voces Nativas. ¿Cuál fue tu experiencia como traductora y como traductora de estas historias del volumen Voces Nativas de América en Buenos Aires, que tradujiste del español al guaraní? Because she translated the stories from Spanish into Guarani. Yeah.
Bueno, mi idioma, el idioma de mis padres, es el idioma guaraní, que es un idioma originario de acá de Sudamérica, pero es solamente idioma oficial en Paraguay y en Bolivia. ¿Sí? La particularidad que tiene este idioma originario es que de las casi 12 millones de personas que lo hablan, más de la mitad no tiene una identidad indígena. ¿Sí? Y eso es consecuencia de muchas cosas, del mestizaje, ¿no? La mezcla de culturas que hay acá en Sudamérica, pero también porque hay mucho prejuicio y mucha discriminación hacia los pueblos originarios. Entonces muchas veces esas raíces originarias en las familias, en nuestras familias, son olvidadas, ¿no? Entonces, con respecto a mi trabajo en este libro, en Voces Nativas de América en Buenos Aires, yo fui convocada por la Asociación Argentina de Traductores e Intérpretes para traducir los cuentos de Darío Juárez, ¿sí? Yo ya lo conocía a él es un docente que había sido mi alumno, también había estudiado guaraní conmigo, porque él también, igual que yo, tiene raíces guaraníes. Bueno, esta para mí fue una experiencia muy desafiante, ¿no? Tenía que traducir 5 cuentos que transcurrían en un escenario de ciudad, en un escenario citadino en Buenos Aires, ¿no? Y los cuentos hablaban sobre creencias y personajes del mundo guaraní, ¿sí? Era una mezcla, también así como somos nosotros, ¿no? Que tenemos raíces guaraníes, pero nacimos en Buenos Aires, ¿no? Y transcurrimos toda nuestra vida acá en la ciudad. Me pareció que era un hermoso desafío participar de este proyecto, porque es un libro que contiene 3 idiomas nativos de los más hablados en la ciudad y en la provincia de Buenos Aires, ¿no? Y porque este libro mostraba la diversidad lingüística y cultural que hay en Buenos Aires, que son parte del día a día de nuestro país, pero que muchas veces son invisibilizadas, ¿no? Entonces me parecía un proyecto muy lindo, ¿no? Y el efecto que tiene este tipo de publicaciones es que, por ejemplo, este libro que estamos presentando acá, por el peso que tienen estos idiomas y el guaraní, que es el idioma más hablado en Argentina después del castellano, este libro fue declarado de interés cultural por el Consejo Deliberante de un municipio acá en Buenos Aires que se llama Tigre, y también fue declarado de interés legislativo por la Cámara de Diputados de la provincia de Buenos Aires. Entonces, todo eso hace que haya sido una experiencia, la verdad, hermosa para mí.
So thank you very much. I'm going to now try to put what Verónica said in English. So she was actually talking about the Guarani language as an original or indigenous language, and it was the first language that she spoke because it's the language of her parents. She was brought up, obviously born and brought up in Buenos Aires, and her parents are from Paraguay. And it's an official language. Guarani is an official language in 2 countries only, in Bolivia and Paraguay, but there are about 12 million speakers of Guarani. Not all of them, though, identify themselves as having a Guarani identity. So there's a difference, and the difference has to do with the mixing of ethnicities that has occurred over decades, and also to do in part with the discrimination, the prejudice against indigenous people in Latin America. So this identidad originaria, this indigenous identity in families, within families, has been very often left aside and ignored. And her work of translation she considers very, very important because it came through Ati. It came as an invitation from Ati to translate these stories by Darío Juárez, who also identifies himself as Guarani, teaches Guarani language. I have to say, incidentally, that both Verónica and Darío taught Guarani on an ATI online course, which I joined in September. So I'm actually talking to my teacher here. So did you understand that, more or less? Verónica, estoy diciendo que estoy hablando con mi profesora, okay? Because Darío y vos me enseñaron Guarani en un curso de la ATI. Okay, so her task was to translate 5 stories that Darío Juárez had originally written in Spanish, and they were challenging because they actually contained this mixing of beliefs and these characters who are also a mixture of identities, and that's the challenge. The Guarani roots, but also characters who have were born and lived in Buenos Aires. So that was what presented the most challenges. So Guarani is the most widely spoken language after Spanish in Argentina. And it shows, and especially in Buenos Aires, it shows that there is great diversity, cultural and linguistic diversity, even in the big city of Buenos Aires. Now, the effect of this type of publication, the first important thing is the message that it sends to these families who have a choice. Do they speak in Guarani, their family language, to their children, or do they speak to them in Spanish? To actually have a book that has stories in Guarani published, launched at the book fair, the Buenos Aires Book Fair, that was such a momentous occurrence. so much so that it was also launched at the council in Tigre. Tigre is a suburb of Buenos Aires. It was declared as a book that had cultural interest by the local government of the city council in Tigre, and also it was regarded as a book of interest by the local Cámara de Diputados, the Chamber of Representatives at provincial level, at the province of Buenos Aires level. So that's amazing, and I'm going to check the time. 6 minutes past 5. So we have time perhaps to discuss one or two challenges. I think I'm just going to quickly say that once the book, the amazing thing is that once you have the books, you start the translation process. And it is now where my work as a translator from Spanish into English starts. And the challenges that I have seen is in one particular story from this book by Sonia Alcócer, who is originally from Bolivia, lives in Buenos Aires, and composes her stories orally. So she is basically a storyteller. Is that orality? Orality presents a particular challenge, and I think that we want. I'm co-translating this story with Miriam Tobin, who did her MA in 2020. 2021, I think, finished her MA in 2021 at the University of East Anglia, and it's fascinating to actually collaborate on the process and discuss the source text. So challenges, what are the challenges translating from these languages?
Sure. Along the same lines, I would just mention one other example, again, from LALT. A wonderful writer and trained linguist who we've had the chance to publish, named Gladys Camacho Rios, who's from Bolivia, the Cochabamba region, is a native speaker of Quechua Sureño, southern Quechua. And as part of her fieldwork, she records conversations and stories from monolingual and bilingual Quechua speakers in that region. And we had the opportunity to publish one of these stories that she had collected, which is a fantastic, scary story. And it was translated by a wonderful translator and a friend called Noemi Candori Arias, who similarly is bilingual in Spanish and Southern Quechua. And what I love about her translation practice is that her practice is very oral in the sense of the translation. She doesn't translate into any kind of like neutral or academic register, but rather into the way Spanish would sound when spoken by a bilingual Quechua Spanish speaker from her community. So translating that into English presented a challenge that I'm sure many of us are familiar with, which is how do you try to recreate some very specific regional variant of a language that's from a particular place in English, in this case, in a language that obviously has no specific corollary to the way someone from Cochabamba, Bolivia, who speaks both Quechua and Spanish, to how they would speak Spanish. So it was a question of trying to really study the kind of idiosyncrasies of that Spanish, find where the Quechua was coming through in grammar or in syntax or in vocabulary, and try to replicate that in a way that helped the reader to understand that the English was kind of undergirded by a different language kind of coming up from within itself.
Yeah. Is that attentive care towards the source text and looking at how certain traits of the source text are still present in the translation into Spanish, and then go back to the source text, inquire, find out, is that to and fro, isn't it?
Exactly.
Crossing back and forth,
Yeah, going back and forth across the bridge a few times.
Yes, fantastic. And Silvina, I'm particularly interested in the strategy of leaving words in the original language that Eliza Tabor used, and you commented on that.
I'll read a brief quote from her translator's note because, So she says, Dream para Our Souls, which is the title of the book, is a contemporary counterpart to the Aibur Rapita, I'm sorry about the pronunciation of the Guarani, a collection of sacred Ya Guarani myths. And she says, I am translated the Guarani terms that reference these myths and expounded their literal and cultural meanings in the notes. And she gives an example. She says the first poem, which is Apir, Aparezco, Apu, renders and blurs the difference between the origin of the lyric voice and the world, given that Ñe'e means both word and soul in Guarani. The birth of the poet provokes the awakening of the ancestral ontology and epistemology embedded in the language he writes in. So it was very important in Eliza's case to be able to leave certain words in their original language and address this in her translator's note. And it's very important for her to be knowledgeable of the culture. And I want to add that as editors, we pay a lot of attention to the knowledge that the translator presents beyond this book itself, the book they are translating, and the spaces that might open from there, beyond the book.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because there are notes to the collection, comprehensive notes, and a very detailed account of the translation process as well. So I fully recommend that, this translation has been done with a lot of care and with a lot of respect for not only the language but also the culture. And Verónica, desafíos en tu experiencia de traductora del guaraní, sobre todo en los cuentos de Darío Juárez, Cururú, por ejemplo, ¿no? El problema de los neologismos. So I'm asking Verónica about a very particular challenge that has to do with the presence of neologisms in indigenous languages that, because most of the speakers of indigenous languages in Latin America are also speakers of language, there are certain words which they just normally use in Spanish. Yeah.
Sí, hay muchos desafíos siempre, pero uno cortito para ser breve es el que aparece en el cuento Cururú, que significa el sapo, ¿sí? Y en un momento aparece un brindis, ¿no es cierto? Entonces el brindis en la cultura guaraní no es algo tradicional, digamos, ¿no? Entonces el decir salud, cuando uno brinda, ¿no? Por lo menos en castellano se dice salud. Yo entonces, mi desafío era ese, ¿no? Pensar cómo hago la traducción de esto. Entonces, después de meditarlo un rato, lo que decidí fue tomemos, en vez de decir, como decía en castellano, salud por el sapo, ¿no? Yo puse, la traducción que hice fue tomemos en honor al sapo, digamos, ¿no? Buscando que sea algo que se comprenda, ¿no? A la intención del autor, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, ese es un pequeño ejemplo. También otros ejemplos es el uso de neologismos, que por ahí el hablante de guaraní usa las palabras en castellano de artefactos, por ejemplo, modernos. En el caso de los cuentos de Darío apareció moto de agua, por ejemplo. Entonces, yo decidí poner esa expresión en castellano porque puede generar una interrupción en la lectura del guaraní hablante. Sin embargo, el guaraní hablante va leyendo en guaraní, encuentra la expresión moto de agua y no le genera ninguna interrupción. Bueno, esos son algunos de los desafíos que aparecen.
So Verónica was just telling us about two particular instances where she had to think very hard on what to do in her translation into Guarani. One came from the story in this book called Cururú, which means sapo, toad. And at one point, one of the characters says, salud por el sapo. So they are actually proposing a toast in honor or to the toad. And salud is not a concept that exists as such in the Guarani culture. So she had to sort of think around what she could do with that. And she, in the end, put what would be in Guarani, let's drink to the toad. Okay, so this drinking to without using the word cheers or salud, which would be the Spanish word. And then another instance, which I just mentioned, is the presence of neologisms. Like, for example, in one of these stories, the term moto de agua or jet ski, and Guarani speakers just, use the Spanish word. So she decided to keep the Spanish word because she didn't want to produce an interruption in the reading. She wanted the reading to flow and for the Guarani story to reflect the usage of the Guarani language by speakers today. That mixing is very much used, and she was quite happy to do the same in her story. Thank you. That's amazing. There's tons more we could talk about and we could say, and I'm constantly aware of the time. I just want to say something about the Guarani word for translator, la palabra guaraní for, para decir traductor. Could you tell us the word and what it means, Verónica? Because I love this word. I really love this word. Yeah.
Nyembo Hasahara.
Okay. Niembo Hasahara, which means, ¿qué significa?
Que significa el que pasa de una lengua a otra.
Sí, pero también tiene esa idea de que transforma las palabras o something like that, isn't it? At least
Claro.
that's how Darío explained it. Así lo explicó
Porque
Darío, como es el que
exacto.
transforma las palabras, he or she who transforms words. Okay, so I just think that we can all relate to that. That's what we do. We transform words when we translate. There might be one or two questions that you might want to put to us, and I know that we are very, very much on the time, actually 1 minute overrun. Has anybody got any pressing questions that they want to ask? If not, we can talk over a drink. Any translators from Spanish here? Okay, some of you. Have I persuaded any of you to perhaps look into Indigenous? Okay, great. Mission accomplished. Thank you very much for coming to listen to this panel. On behalf of the BCLT and on behalf of Latin American Literature Today, Ugly Duckling Press, and the champion of teaching culture and the Guarani language, Verónica, muchísimas gracias. Silvina,
Gracias.
thank you so much for being here, and Arthur.
Thank you, gracias.